So we've talked about the beginnings of ragtime and the way in which it flourishes through artists like Scott Joplin. But I have this idea, kind of a bigger idea than just ragtime, about genre, about styles. I'm kind of the mind that most musical styles really only exist in kind of like some sort of crystallized, pure form, really for only about 5, maybe 10 years at the most. Um, but after that time, they evolve, they change. People experiment with kind of the standard practices and try new things out. Um, I think that's true of whether we're talking about any musical style you can think of, whether it's rap, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's jazz, no matter what it might be. And I would argue that's very much the same case here with ragtime. So, if we say that ragtime starts in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, for instance, by the time we get into, not the 1900s, that evolution, that change is already underway. And I would suggest that what we're going to look at here are the kind of natural extensions of ragtime as it heads into the 20th century. So we're going to start with this idea of stride piano. Stride piano essentially is a variation on a lot of ragtime practices that develops on the East Coast in particular. So what we're going to hear with stride piano is a lot more variation within that left hand feel. It won't be quite that same steady pop 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 pop, that steady time keeping element, because we've already had syncopation in the right hand, and now pianists are saying, well, if I got this kind of tricky rhythmic thing going on in the right hand, why not do it in the left hand as well? And so we see much more kind of elaborate rhythmic gestures within stride piano as a whole. Additionally, here's where people start to play around with form. So I've already given you ragtime form as this thing to understand and to kind of internalize when you're listening to any of these pieces by Scott Joplin. But now when we get into ragtime, we can then say, well, or when we get into stride piano, we can say, well, how are people experimenting with the form? If you think about it, by the time we get into, let's say, for instance, the 1910s, a lot of listeners are accompanied are in a lot of ways used to that straightforward form, A A B B A C C D D. And so if a player knows that's going to come up and they purposefully change it, it provides this kind of interesting moment for listeners where they say, wait a second, I didn't expect that. What's going on here? So within ragtime, we start to see these slight improvisations with arrangement itself. The melody, for the most part, is maintained. The harmony, for the most part, is maintained. But the form is this thing that gets altered. And one way in which a lot of stride pianists would experiment with form is by interjecting other songs into a well-known piece. So we can kind of think of this as like, the earliest forms of mashups, if you will, right? Where we're taking two things that might be somewhat different, disparate in some sort of way, and putting them together to make something new. Well, one musician who's worthy of talking about this relative to this idea is James P. Johnson, and I'll give you some musical examples to listen to here. And given that a lot of you are just being exposed to ragtime, much less ragtime and stride, it might be a little bit tricky to hear the differences between James P. Johnson and Scott Joplin's music, that difference between stride piano and ragtime. But I want you to try to listen for it. Listen for how he doesn't necessarily adhere to ragtime form, and how he's playing around with rhythm as a whole. Now, another concept that we need to talk about to help understand this evolution is a change between straight rhythms and swung rhythms. So the way that I like to explain straight rhythms is that we can think of things in terms of, let's say, a ruler. Let's say at a certain amount of time within a song, we can divide it into equal chunks, right? Just like we take a ruler and we divide it into 12 equal inches. And further subdivisions within there are of equal division as well. In some ways, this is a straight rhythm. So if I were to take a beat, a rhythm pattern like this, and I were to subdivide it, split each of these beats in two, dot, 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 that's all even. I can split each of these beats into 4 chunks. Dot, 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 dot. That's all even. Swung rhythms, on the other hand, play around with those divisions. Rather than assuming that they're all equal, they try to give it a lilt. They try to give it a feel based off of slight delays, for the most part, where a subdivision is pushed back just a little bit. So if I have dot, 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 and that's my straight rhythm, if I instead go dot, 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 this thing is staying at the exact same pace, but my subdivision has changed, right? Here is straight, dot, 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 swung, dot, 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 dot. Now that's a pretty strong swing. There's a lot of swing there. And so we're not talking that it's like, again, some perfectly mathematically derived division that we're moving towards. Every player swings slightly differently. And stylistically, we'll hear differences in the amount of swing as time goes on. Maybe you can think of that relative to some of the music that you listen to. There's some styles, for instance, heavy metal. Heavy metal is a very straight rhythm. But there are certain styles of rock and roll, of electric guitar-driven rock and roll, that are very much based off of this idea of swing, of giving something a lilt. Maybe if you need another comparison, think about even just an idea of motion, of walking. And there's a sense in which you can march where every movement is perfectly aligned and timed and divided. And then there's ways of walking, ways of holding yourself that are a little bit more loose, that kind of don't necessarily fall into strict divisions, but they have kind of a slipperiness to them. And that kind of makes it interesting, maybe more relaxed. Now, what I'm going to play for you, or what I'm going to give to you to listen to in terms of these subdivisions, is going to be James P. Johnson's Carolina Shout. And I would like you to listen to Carolina Shout and think about how that swings differently when we compare it to, for instance, The Entertainer. Now, that's not to say that The Entertainer is completely straight. Da 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 da. That's got a little bit of a swing to it also. But I might argue James P. Johnson, he swings even more. He's even got a little bit more in there. And part of that is enabled by the fact that he's no longer keeping that straight rhythmic pattern, that umpa in the left hand, but rather he's playing with these subdivisions. And he's allowed to, in some ways, move things around where it doesn't fit perfectly on some evenly divided grid. And this is kind of an important aspect of, I would say, all of the jazz styles we talk about. We can think about music as lying on some sort of perfectly aligned grid, as if though the musicians are like supposed to put notes here, 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 here. But the fact is, we just feel these things. And some things just feel interesting. They feel different. Later on down the road, we're going to talk about super fine divisions in rhythmic feel, where you can't even really notate it out. I mean, you could assign some sort of quantifiable number to the differences between these things, but that completely misses the point. It's something that you just have to kind of like feel in your body in some sort of way. And so, maybe as you get used to listening to these tunes, think about how this swing is a felt experience for you. Now, one other major change that occurs in about the 1910s or so, right, after ragtime has kind of made its mark on U.S. culture. It's selling tons of sheet music. People are hearing it on player pianos. Its artists are becoming well-known figures in American entertainment. Well, ragtime goes from being a solo piano music to something that people experiment with within ensemble situations. So this is going to be an important point that I almost promise you will be on, your first quiz or whatever, some sort of thing that I'm going to give you where I'm going to ask you, what is the typical instrumentation of ragtime? Piano. Piano, solo piano is the typical organization, and it's a fully composed piece that is played as written. Stride pushes against that, it starts to improvise with form, but it's still a solo piano music. We, though, also can find musicians who are listening to these sounds, these swung rhythms, these particular syncopated melodies within ragtime, and saying, well, how can we apply that to ensembles? In particular, thinking about bands. And here we're talking about brass bands, brass and drum bands. So, trombones, trumpets, tubas, accompanied rhythmically by snare drums and bass drums and occasionally cymbals. The kinds of instrumentation that you might find in a marching band. Now, when we think about most marching bands, they tend to be very kind of march-oriented music. But somebody like James Reese Europe says, oh, wait a second, we have this whole other musical expression that feels differently. What if we apply that exact same feel to this kind of music? And so he starts to organize bands to play ragtime music, and he arranges out all the parts for different aspects of this ensemble. The trumpets are going to play this part, the trombones are going to play this part, the tubas, they're going to hold the low end, so they're going to hold that umpa sort of thing. And the drums are going to also maintain that rhythmic sort of feel. James Reese Europe becomes so successful with this on the East Coast, I believe in New York, that eventually he is asked to put together an army band, primarily made of African American musicians. Because around this time period in the 1910s, we have World War I. And one interesting aspect of these world wars, and we're kind of going through these conflicts right now, right? These international conflicts, is that quite often a big part of the front, if you will, of fighting is a cultural front. That it's not just people fighting with weapons and violence, but it's also this idea of you're trying to convince people that, look, our way of doing, our way of living, our way of being is something valuable and it's important. And if you can appreciate our culture, then you must recognize that this violence is wrong in some sort of way, or at least our perspective is right in some sort of way. So James Reese Europe was basically in charge of one of the first Army Battalion bands made exclusively of African American musicians. And again, this is all due to the fact that, segregation within the military was assumed. It was a huge part of it. Now, for James Reese Europe, this was an interesting and powerful experience. He says, we have developed a kind of symphony music that no matter what else you think is different and distinctive, and that lends itself to the playing of the peculiar compositions of our race. My success had come from a realization of the advantages of sticking to the music of my own people. So already, these ideas of race are embedded well within the music. That something was happening within African American culture that was being shared, brought over with this European or with this band into Europe, to the front lines of France, to the front lines all throughout Europe. And people are saying, wow, this music is interesting and it's energizing and it's exciting. And yeah, these Americans, they're bringing energy and an optimism to what is going on here. So, I've given you a slight clip of an interview, if you will, or at least kind of a historical reenactment of James Reese Europe and kind of the experiences that his quote-unquote Hellfighters band brought over into France. And the example they give is when they go over there, they play the French national anthem for the French. But they do it with all of these arrangements drawn from ragtime, drawn from stride piano, and it blows everybody's mind to the point at which a lot of European musicians are saying, well, how are they doing this? How are they making these sounds? Because I don't have those sounds on my instrument. But it grabs everybody's attention. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that all of James Reese Europe's music was strictly arranged and composed. There wasn't really a sense of improvisation yet. And improvisation is going to be a key idea for us as jazz starts to develop. The kinds of songs they played: ragtime, marches, as any good marching band does, but also to the plantation songs and the spirituals that were part of the minstrelsy tradition, that were part of the African American tradition. And so because of this, we can say in a lot of ways that James Reese Europe becomes a key figure in introducing jazz and ragtime, the precursor, to Europe during World War I. In a lot of ways, what they deposit there culturally actually takes up a life of its own in Europe. But then back home, it also gives a sense in which, this isn't just solo piano music. This is something that can be bigger than that. Next up, we'll look at yet another innovator within this early period of pre-jazz, Jelly Roll Morton.